Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. For folks who are new to this podcast, the purpose of this podcast is to give possible options associated with creating your own rules for board games, role-playing games, and war games. And folks who are interested in board games, anticipate by about episode 10, we'll dig into board games at least for 1 or 2 recordings. So apologies to board games creation enthusiasts that are waiting for board game information, although some of the stuff covered, particularly associated with rolling mechanics, and to a lesser extent setting, may also be useful for you. I've realised recording the last episode that I need to be very mindful to have the mathematics in front of me before I start recording a podcast. I tried to ad-lib some stuff, and it made me have to go back and re-record a particular section. For folks who've heard the previous episode, you probably should be able to interpret where that was. But this recording, I wanted to cover 2 topics which I think are intertwined but important. The first is associated with how you playtest your own rules. And the second is associated with the environment, the group of testers, playtesters, but actually probably fully fledged players, to be perfectly honest, for the Just Plain Chaos rule set, to give some illustration to the benefits of both these testing schemes. Now, I wanted to give a slightly curious historical narrative associated with how I ended up playing the Just Plain Chaos rule set at work. I have historically written a novella, a couple of novellas, which have been called Field of Chaos. And I first published them in 2010, but actually they're from stuff that I had written in 1992 to about 1995. So the Field of Chaos novella series was something that I had already published and had developed a rule set around, which I had just playtested with myself. We'll talk a little bit more about that. As it happened, the time frame associated with playing this rule set at work also coincided with a fellow who I knew in Australia, let's just call him a former friend, who was coming to stay with me, who was also written about in the Field of Chaos writing. So he and I thought at the time, would be able to play the Field of Chaos rule set and, get some feedback, basically, before I actually took it into the office to play. Unfortunately, for a variety of factors, that didn't work out. He was supposed to stay with us for 3 months. He ended up staying with us only for a couple of weeks. It wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. We kind of parted ways. I'd also decided moving forward with that thing that I wasn't going to do any active promotion for Field of Chaos going forwards. So, pulled out a bunch of graphics, did a rewrite, basically went through a series of different things with the Just Plain Chaos rule set, and that is what created the Just Plain Chaos rule set. I then had the problem that I was originally anticipating at least 6, if not 12 hours worth of playtesting time with this fellow before I took it into work. So I had to construct what playtesting would look like without having an active opponent. And what I did was I created a series of scenarios which were typically in the vicinity of 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 foot, with a variety of different obstacles, terrain obstacles, and movement obstacles to see what would happen as the rules were actually played. And I wanted to make a point here that what I was looking to optimize for in some regard was associated with simplicity. I wanted a rule set that would be relatively fast. Typically with my work play group, there's usually between 4 to 6, at most potentially 8. But within this number, I need to make sure that the rules are sufficiently dynamic that people will be able to keep up and hold interest. The worst thing you can do in these circumstances is introduce additional dice mechanics that will slow down the play of the game. So what I did was I created a series of scenarios and I play tested various rules myself. And through this, I actually simplified the rules greatly. I removed multiple weapon types. I removed additional dice rolling. I reduced the dice rolling down, and I think, as I've noted in the previous recording, I could probably make additional simplifications to speed up the gameplay a little bit, particularly associated with where the bullets actually strike the body. So, through this experience, I simplified the rules, I changed some of the mechanics, and I got to a point where I thought this is probably playable. Now, to get to that point, I had to do a series of things which are probably quite specific to each rule set. Just Plain Chaos as a rule set is really on the cusp of wargaming. The role-playing game elements set up the character. There's some role-playing elements as the characters are played, obviously. But most of the battle dynamics and these kind of things is effectively wargaming rule sets. So within that, I realized that I had to make sure that the battle dynamics were really, really smooth. And what I moved towards was a notion of 3 basic weapon types and the fact that the play dynamics for characters that held those weapon types would have to be different in order for them to succeed in the early scenarios in the game. I'll talk a little bit about creating scenarios when I talk a little bit more about my work experience. So in doing this, I had a certain degree of confidence, but the main thing is, and I'll talk a little bit about computer simulation in a future recording, but this is not a time for computer simulation to be used. It'd be relatively easy to pull together spreadsheets and just simulate what the experience would be, but you actually physically have to roll dice. You actually physically have to get a sense of what the dynamics are. One of the things I'll say with Just Playing Chaos rule set is you need to keep your eye on paperwork. And that is a dynamic that if I was to do this thing again, I would simplify so you wouldn't have to keep your eye on the paperwork for quite the length of time that you have to through playing Just Playing Chaos. So in this experience, I had a number of tactile experiences with the rule set before I actually took it out and played it with live audience, so to speak. So in this scenario, I knew what I was optimizing for, and I tried to optimize around that as much as possible. But there were still elements that were a little bit clunky. So, for example, there is a clip or magazine dynamic in the game, which means you fire a certain number of shots, and then you have to change the magazine out at various times. There can be magazine jams. There can be all kinds of functional jams as well. And that dynamic as well is a little bit clunky, and it's a little bit hard to remember in the context of general gameplay. So if I was going to redo something, that was certainly something that I'd flagged. But I thought, these people are remotely competent. I should be able to play these game rules as they are currently. And what it is about is building confidence more than anything. It's building confidence and certainty associated with the rule set and just getting a sense of what the rules mean. Now, let us talk a little bit about the work situation. I typically run a game once a month on a Tuesday evening. And what has happened, because these things just happen, is I've had doctor's appointments far away where I've had to cancel a game, and I've had a bunch of different things where occasionally games are cancelled. And in the worst case scenario, I think 2 months went by, and then I came back to the rule set relatively cold. Now, that is as much my fault as anyone's. I should have replayed the rules before I went into work and played them again, just to remind myself of some of the basic mechanics. But within the first 30 minutes of play, I flubbed up a couple of mechanics and just rectified them through play. The nature of the work environment is that typically I will have, like I said, maybe 4, 6, at most 8 players, and they're all very easygoing players. While we have had occasionally power players come in and participate, in general they're interested in the social and cathartic aspects of the game as much as they are the actual gameplay. And the fact that I've brought in detailed painted miniatures, scenery, put on the game, have a relatively reasonable narrative flow through the process of the game, I think I'm in a relatively good position with my co-workers associated with getting this game and having it played. So occasional flubs, occasional mistakes, but also I come from a school of games mastery, if that's such a thing, where I'm always trying to alleviate any points of concern. I'm always looking to create a gameplay environment which is ultimately fun and relaxing. It should be the antithesis of the workday. It should be something that people look forward to and gravitate towards. You've got to use word of mouth in some regard. You've got to use a variety of different things to actually get people interested in playing these games. And certainly through the D&D period and now running the Just Playing Chaos rule set, I've made sure that the context is always set associated with this is a fun thing that you should enjoy doing. And that is an interesting perspective because I think certainly I've started listening to podcasts now. There are podcasts out, I'm sure you're all well aware of this, I'm coming late to the game, where people are actively podcasting their D&D sessions primarily. And you get to hear the different narrative styles, the different games mastering styles that people are working through. And what I find interesting is I started this thing when I was probably, I don't know, I found books where I was like 9. So by 9, I was writing my own rule sets. By 11, I was doing it with greater degree of detail. But the actual format of role-playing for me was something that came through my, from age 6, 7, 8, where I was either being a player or actively games mastering games. And through this, I developed a series of techniques, particularly doing mathematics in my head, but also other techniques that I think are really very important and useful. And what you see and hear through these podcasts that people run of their Games Mastery sessions is that there are so many different styles. And I think one of the things that I find fascinating is, personally, I want to avoid any degree of nervousness with regards to doing games mastering. I need to have a certain degree of authority. I need to have a certain degree of mutual respect. But really what I'm trying to do here is give a really impressive tactile experience to my co-workers in the game. And I'm very mindful of that in terms of how I construct the games, in terms of how I construct the scenarios, in terms of how I do a variety of different things to make sure that the game is coherent. Now, when we were running the D&D campaign, I started off with a really old school module, but that fell away very rapidly because the players actually wanted to explore the universe, and the module gave very little details associated with the universe. I was in a universe creation mode. And what I did was I created week-to-week scenarios that they would go through associated with very particular narratives, very particular story plots, certainly a lot associated with discovery, which is what I've talked about historically and is very important in the Just Plain Chaos rule set as well. But just to make sure that each week there was a new, different, challenging set of problems that they were looking to explore. Now, Just Plain Chaos does that, but it does it in a completely different setting. And it's a setting which, in large part, has been created by certain aspects of my historical writing, but also it is something which is defined by scenery and narrative and questioning. And sometimes there are different ways that you can present narrative. So there's sometimes explicit narrative where you're just basically telling your players some information. But then, equally important, in fact, in many regards more important, there is an inquisitive narrative which comes through the players actively asking questions and interrogating their environment. So when I construct these scenarios and I divide up these games, be it D&D or be it Just Plain Chaos, and I divide these games into a series of separate scenarios, which I then enact over a multi-week period. That should give some indication of the way in which I like to run these games and the experiences around them. But associated with rule sets, certainly within the first 3 or 4 games of the Just Plain Chaos rule set, I added a variety of different dynamics, particularly associated with grenades, shotguns, a variety of different pieces of weaponry that the players were encountering. But also I realized that there was a trajectory with this game which would probably see it ending sometime in the new year. So we probably have maybe 3 or 4 games left of Just Plain Chaos before we can stop this scenario and potentially restart another scenario in the rule set or find another rule set or a variety of different things. I was actually kind of hoping that I could test out some of the rule sets that I was going to float here with the work sessions, because that gives an interesting set of player dynamics. Now, I need to talk a little bit more associated with how my co-workers actively play these games. There are typically 2 or so, sometimes 1 player who is heavily focused on strategy. There will be players that are heavily focused on tactics. And the distinction, if you have that question, is strategy is associated with long-term planning. It's associated with goals in the future. It's associated with how you're going to get to those goals. And tactics are very much associated with the short-term movement, the short-term planning, particularly when you're in battle encounters. And what I found fascinating is sometimes at points of tension or points where there are a series of things going on and the group needs to come to a tactical agreement, I sometimes fall back in those circumstances. I intentionally, go get a drink or something like that to give them the additional time to plan. Now, this is artificial. This is something that would not happen in real circumstances. But in real circumstances, you'd have people that had a degree of interaction with one another where they would be able to intuit some of this. So I feel relatively comfortable giving them this freebie so they can actually plan out how they're going to enact certain scenarios. And what I find fascinating through this, particularly in terms of stepping away, is I too am enacting my own scenarios associated with the other combatants. Sometimes there are effectively non-player characters, there are non-hostile combatants, basically combatants that are fighting on the sides of the players. So there are always these dynamics, and I think it's something that I find very exciting within these dynamics to find new narratives and new ways of exploring a variety of different elements within the game. So that is my background associated with how I run these games at work. And certainly in terms of real feedback, I've hardened the rules in recent months. So as you'll see, the rules that are presented in the podcast feed are from July, and I'm talking to you in December. Now, honestly, we haven't had that many games. We probably had 2 or 3 games since the rule set was hardened. But it is something that I've realised early on I could make a few subtle changes. But after that, let's just play the rules as they are, with the view that I can give post-mortems well after the fact, and certainly I will do so in this very podcast recording. So I hope I've described scenarios where one creates one's own testing and does that testing, and then associated with how I run these games at work in order to get greater feedback on the rule systems and dynamics. As I have said in prior recordings, this is a word-of-mouth podcast. If you like this podcast, and you've listened to a few recordings now, please reach out to your friends. Provide your friends this audio, provide your friends a link to the website. What I'm interested in doing here is creating a group narrative. If you maintain a Facebook page or a blog, or a variety of other means to get the word out associated with this podcast, please do that, because I'm not going to accept any sponsors. I'm not going to be requesting any money. There's going to be no pledge drives associated with My Rules Are Better. This is a podcast which is purely for the listeners, made by me to reach out to a group of people, because I actually have some interesting questions that I want to ask the listenership. I'd like to reach out to folks in the Oldhammer community, for example, because I think square-based fantasy is an area that I'd really like to discuss in this podcast and explore with a greater degree of detail. I have a personal interest in greenskins. I love a variety of different greenskin miniature series. Every Kev Adams Kickstarter I managed to get, I had to send a large parcel off to be painted, because it's just obscene the amount of unpainted Kev Adams metal I have currently. But I'd like to reach out to folks that are in the Oldhammer community, and also folks that are writing rule sets around square-based fantasy, because this is an area that fascinates me. I mentioned in the last recording that I'm interested in exploring a 15mm rule set for that. But I'm just interested in hearing from folks that are already doing the heavy lifting associated with this kind of thing. Similarly, if you've written your own rule sets, if you'd like to talk more, I'm more than happy to actually open this up like a Skype call, for example, and have people call in and have detailed discussions associated with rule systems that they're creating, or feedback that they have associated with various gameplay dynamics. So this podcast could go in a number of different directions, and I wanted to make it clear early on that the monologue format, particularly me talking about things and referencing mathematics and this kind of stuff, doesn't have to be the way this podcast goes. It's based purely on listener feedback and listener interest. So please consider sending folks the audio link, sending folks the website link, myrulesarebetter.com, and getting people involved with the discussion here, because certainly that's my interest associated with this podcast. Tom Barbalet, sitting in San Jose, still recovering, as you can probably hear from my voice, from the virus, signing out.